Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going, and as I like to remind you each day, it expands our base. I was intrigued by one question in the 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. And the question was, what would you do differently? Or where did you disagree with? Or what did you do with Joe Biden? And it was an interesting question because vice presidents are generally asked whether or not they disagree with or have contributed to or had a role in decision-making when they are vice president. I am always reminded that in 1960, Dwight Eisenhower was asked at a press conference, "Can you think of anything that Vice President Nixon has done or contributed to in your administration?" And Eisenhower, with a smile, almost joking, said, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." It was a terrible blow to Richard Nixon, and the Democrats made an ad, which you can see on the living room candidate if you go to the 1960 section. It's quite interesting to watch. Eisenhower, by the way, regretted it terribly. But the simple fact of the matter is, vice presidents don't make decisions. They may contribute to decision-making, but in the end, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here with the President of the United States. There is no doubt that presidents and vice presidents, well, sometimes they disagree, but it's always in private, or occasionally it's in public. Let me give you an example. In the court packing case in 1937, John Nance Garner, vice president to Franklin Roosevelt, said privately to members of Congress that he did not agree with the court packing plan. In fact, John Nance Garner picked up his bags, packed them up, went off to Texas. He didn't want to be a part of what Roosevelt was doing. And that was really the beginning of the end of the relationship between President Roosevelt and Vice President Garner. By the way, it was also John Nance Garner who remarked about the mother who had two sons. One went to sea, the other became vice president, and neither one was ever heard from again. Of course, that isn't true. And we have had examples where vice presidents have disagreed with presidents in subsequent years, but they do it in private. They don't make a public issue of it. The confidentiality between a president and a vice president is clear. Now, we've seen moments when there have been ruptures. Hubert Humphrey is a great example, vice president under Lyndon Johnson. When Hubert Humphrey, early in the administration, made a comment at the cabinet meeting that Johnson didn't like, he put Hubert Humphrey on deep freeze for almost a year. And of course, when Humphrey was running for president in 1968 and had real disagreements with Johnson on Vietnam, well, Humphrey was really afraid to differentiate himself. He ultimately had to in his September 30th speech in Salt Lake City. But Johnson never got over the fact that Humphrey was subverting his policy in Vietnam. By the way, I can't tell you who Johnson voted for, Nixon or Humphrey. It's interesting to note that vice presidents of the United States have one job, and that is to support the president. They're not supposed to have independent policies. They're not supposed to take independent action. They are really the servant completely of the president. So when Kamala Harris was put on the spot and asked, where she would differ in policy, well, of course she can't give an answer. Now, the one thing she said that intrigued me is, and she said it subsequently, she said, well, I would put a Republican in my cabinet. That's not unusual. I want you to know Franklin Roosevelt put two leading Republicans in his cabinet. Henry Stimson, a former Secretary of State and Secretary of War, who returned to the cabinet to be Secretary of War during World War II, and Frank Knox, who became Secretary of the Navy in the Roosevelt administration and who was Alf Landon's running mate. He ran for vice president in 1936. Stimson and Knox were read out of the Republican Party by some Republicans who said they're traitors. And of course, we had the example of John F. Kennedy, who put Robert McNamara in as Secretary of Defense. McNamara was a Republican. And C. Douglas Dillon, who had been an Undersecretary of State in the Eisenhower administration and who became Secretary of the Treasury. And of course, maybe one of the classic examples is Richard Nixon, who put John Connally of Texas into his cabinet and really wanted him to become president. I point this out because I want you to understand that it is not unusual. Oh, wait, I forgot one more. Bill Clinton. He put Senator Cohen of Maine in his cabinet as Secretary of Defense. Well, I could go on and on and on. But I think what Kamala Harris was saying is that she would put a Republican in her administration. So immediately I got questioned. Will it be Cheney? Will it be Kinzinger? Will it be someone else? I don't know. But I can tell you that the idea of building a bipartisan administration, to a degree, taking the expertise of an individual and putting them into the role in your administration makes great sense. So Kamala Harris maybe muffed the answer a little bit. But the answer is that in the end, she came through and she said, yes, I'd put a Republican in my cabinet. But did you expect Kamala Harris to put any distance between herself and Joe Biden? Absolutely not. She became vice president because she was chosen by Joe Biden. She's been a loyal vice president, which is the first requirement of any vice president of the United States. You have to be loyal to the president. And the few examples of disagreement that I've given you, well, you can find yourself in the doghouse as John Garner did and as Hubert Humphrey did. But it's unusual. By the way, should Harris be criticized? I hear them now criticizing Harris's border policy. Harris doesn't have a border policy. The Biden administration has a border policy, and she helps to implement it. Do you understand? It's very clear. When this campaign evolves, Joe Biden is going to support Kamala Harris with everything he has, the same way Richard Nixon was supported by Dwight Eisenhower, because it is the legacy which matters. So today I want to reflect with you on the fact that Kamala Harris did a pretty good job. And the question of the relationship between a president and a vice president, that's always a serious question. Hey, wait a minute. Think about Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Well, what do you think? There can be ruptures, there can be changes, there can be different views. But in the end, remember one thing. The job of a vice president is to be the number one cheerleader, assistant for the president. That's their job. Don't forget it. I think it's an important point historically. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am John Rothman. Make sure to follow along and let me know your thoughts on the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing an episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which is, of course, our goal. You can interact with me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. And, of course, my special appreciation to Gogo Zoger, who produces this program every single day. Thanks, Gogo. I am John Rothman. See you tomorrow, right here on Around the Political World with John Rothman.